The most enigmatic creature on the earth is the human being. How complicated, how complex a human being is, there's nothing comparable to it. A human being is endowed with intelligence, and we understand. And we understand, even when we understand what's right and we understand what's wrong, but somehow we're able to, because of conflicts of interest, to override the wrong and to put it in a context, either it's not as bad as it seems to be, which it's even worse than that, or it's even something which is permitted. And a person doesn't allow his conscience to interfere with what he wants. And there's an expression, you put it on the back burner. And sometimes it's on the back burner to the point where you don't even realize. You behave and live like it never happened. People live without conscience. What is really the brakes in a person's life? I mean, to put the brake on. Conscience is key to appropriate behavior, conscience. If a person has conscience and you know something's wrong, there are many lines we're not going to cross because of that conscience. If a person has no conscience, he's more dangerous than an animal. Because even the most vicious predator animal, you could dictate its behavior by knowing its instinct. So if you study that species behavior, you know exactly how to defend yourself and how to deal with it, and even how to entrap it. But a human being, where a human being has intellect and is not dictated by instinct, whatever drives him is going to drive him, and there's no way to know exactly where he's going. Therefore, the human being without conscience is more dangerous than the most vicious animal, because you don't know where he's coming from. It's not predictable. But how do we understand it? Knowing something's wrong, fully knowing, how do you do something wrong? I'm going to ask you a question, because if you do have conscience, you have difficulty understanding how the other person doesn't have conscience. So you'd say he's cut from a different piece of cloth, a different reality. Why were the Jewish people always at another level of all humanity? Going back to Avram, one of the three inborn characteristics of every Jew is conscience, shame. As the Talmud tells us, that one of the most obvious characteristics which every Jew does possess, Rachmanim, they're merciful, Baishonim, they have shame, they have conscience, and the Gomlei Chasodim, and they do acts of loving kindness. Every one of them. A Jew has to possess these characteristics, and if not, the Talmud says you have to question his pedigree. It's a known fact, per capita, there's no more charitable nation than the Jewish people. You may support causes which may not be a Jewish cause, but in terms of feeling for someone else and addressing that person's need, or that whatever that cause may be, Jews are greater supporters than anyone else, because it's in doing charity is inborn. It's an inborn thing. Avraham Avinu, because he had that exceptional level of conscience, therefore he couldn't put his hand in the till and ignore the master. If you recognize the master, how do you behave this way? Avram couldn't behave differently, because he recognized who God was, and having shame, it's shameful to behave differently and not reciprocate and not be appreciative. But if a person has less conscience or no conscience, you can do anything you want. You can put your hand in the till, sleep well at night, and act unabashedly terrible, and you think you're doing great. Nope, not a problem. But a human being even the best human being, the Jew, if you're overwhelmed with desire, although you know it's wrong, at that moment you could blot it out of your mind and act as if it's permitted. But how? You know it's wrong. That's the enigma of the human mind. You know it's wrong, and somehow, because of your conflict or your desire at that moment to do what you want to do, at that moment it's not wrong. Not only is that wrong, you're convinced it's the right thing to do. But how? Normally you would never consider doing. Now all of a sudden, because you're overwhelmed with desire and you have conflict, all of a sudden becomes permitted. How? Well, he said, well, that's why God created the human being, and that's part of the choice, that he has choice to go in either direction, and he has to give him that ability to choose to be like that, because otherwise he would never cross the lines. That's endowing man to do as he wants. That's the image of God, in my image and my form. As God does what he chooses, the human being does what he chooses, but how to do what you choose. So God has to give you that ability to suppress the reality, to behave in a way as if it's permitted totally. Give you an example. God creates Adam and Eve. They're in the Garden of Eden. This is even before he ingests of the tree of knowledge, which he's not permitted to. And God says, every fruit of every tree you're permitted to, that one fruit not. Because it's good and evil. Adam fails in the Garden of Eden. And the Talmud says, if God openly communicated to you and says it's not permitted, how did he eat it? So the Talmud says at that moment, he was a heretic because his desire was to eat it and he was convinced he's going to do it. At that moment, God didn't exist. Didn't exist. When God came after him, when he realized he was diminished, now all of a sudden he has the shame, but it's too late. He already undermined the purity of his soul and the world. He's driven out of the Garden of Eden. Before he ate of that tree, Adam and Eve already had a child. Cain was born. Hevel was born post-sin. Cain was born pre-sin. Okay? Cain goes and he murders his brother due to envy. God says to him, Cain, where's your brother? Am I my brother's keeper? So God says to him, firstly, you were born in the Garden of Eden. As much as you ate of the tree of knowledge, what do you mean? How do you answer God? Am I my brother's keeper? You realize God knows you killed him, you murdered him. So evidently in his mind, it wasn't that clear. Maybe God doesn't know. But if God is the creator, maybe he doesn't know. But how does he not know? Because after he murdered him, he believed that somehow he's going to get away with this. And I always say, and it's known, why is there no perfect crime? The reason why there's no perfect crime is because the one who commits the crime, due to his ego, he has to share it with someone. And ultimately, it gets out that he committed the crime. But how did Cain commit so-called the perfect crime? Because there's nobody around, but he knows God knows. So if God knows, ultimately you're going to get caught. So knowing ultimately you get caught, how do you commit the crime? And even post, he says to God, am I my brother's keeper? How do you speak to God this way? He should admit immediately, it was envy and we had this brawl and I killed him due to my envy. Why wasn't he up front? He says, am I my brother's keeper? So God says to him, but I hear your brother's blood crying out to me. Then who are you trying to dupe? Who are you trying to fool? Okay? So he knew God knew that. So God says, I give you a choice in going into the future. Either you repent, it'll be good. Otherwise, it's not going to be so good. You're going to pay the price. So the Torah tells us Adam left the presence of God in a state of humility. In humility. So the Midrash says He behaved outwardly humble, but he couldn't care less what God thought, because he really believed God doesn't know his inner thoughts. He may know he killed him because that's outward, but to know truly his inner thoughts, God doesn't know this. But how can you believe that? How can you believe that? God's the creator. God drove your parents and you out of the Garden of Eden. He created an immense world, relatively speaking, infinite. And you don't think he knows what you're thinking when he gave you that thought process. And you think you could deceive him, act outwardly humble, and really you're evil in your heart. But he was convinced. And he continued. And what was his area of vocation? Cain. They became weapon manufacturers, him and his children. They manufactured weapons for killing. In those days, you weren't permitted to kill an animal. Definitely not killing a human being. So what are you going to say? Self-defense. Weapons of self-defense. I mean, he himself is a murderer, but he's creating weapons manufactured for self-defense. Okay? You know, you could convince yourself and talk yourself into any story you want. But you realize if you already committed murder due to envy, what do you think you have a weapon? Did you overcome your problem of envy? As you killed this person, you killed many other people. And his family were murderers. The family of Cain. But a human being has that ability. Where does that ability emanate from? I always say, what drives a human being for success? What is the motivating characteristic in every human being that drives him? It's called ego. Ego. I want to be acknowledged. I want to seem to be special. I want to be seen different for the sake of that acknowledgement. And a person will leave no stone unturned, would make every effort to go the extra mile for that ego. Because without that, I'm nothing. I believe if I address it and I will have that acknowledgement, then I'm something. Otherwise, I'm nothing. To be able to tolerate your nothing, it's an intolerable state. Therefore, a person will do anything for that acknowledgement. Hopefully, a person's offered an opportunity, which is not to do something in crime, to become very wealthy, if he has morals and ethics. As much as his ego, he wants recognition, but that to him, because of his values, that's not recognition. You'll be recognized by fellow criminals as you're good at your trade. You know something? That's not an ego booster. That doesn't touch me. But as a decent human being, what society is all about, hard-earned money, to have success in that arena, that means you're top of your game. You know what it means for a person to be called top of his game? We say that Chazal tell us, Yesh lo mana rotza mosayim. If you have 100, you want 200. You have 400, you want 800. As much as you have, you want multiples of that. Why do you want multiples of that? You know, if I'm worth $1 million, I want 2. If I'm Forbes 45, I want to be Forbes 5. And if I'm 5, I want to be Forbes 1. Why? It's all ego. Because as you climb that financial ladder and you recognize to be that, the ego has no limit. No limit. Therefore, you're driven. Because I'm acknowledged at that level and I succeed at that level. So what does it say who I am? I am unique and one of a kind. So if I am that one of a kind, I want everybody to recognize that I'm one and only of that kind. Therefore, you're shooting for number one for that reason. But everything is ego-driven. We say people are egocentric. Everything revolves around themselves to the point they don't even realize what degree they're invested in themselves. And therefore, they can't see their shortcomings. They can't make corrections. They're blind to their own failings. When I say blind, literally blind. Visually, you see. But to be sensitive, to understand that there's something very seriously missing, person doesn't even begin understanding. But again, the challenge of life is it me or is it God? What is proper choice? Proper choice is to do what you don't want to do. What I want to do is what I'm inclined to do. Whatever I'm inclined to do is satisfying me. That gives me a sense of independence. I'm independent. I do what I want. But that's also its ego. Doing what you want, as bad as it may be, and despite the fact how it's not valued by others, but you value it. Well, if I value it, that means it has importance. Many years ago, the Chazon Ish had a meeting with Ben Gurion. This is soon after the founding of the State of Israel. And there was a question about conscripting yeshiva students. What they have in the exemption in the United States, which is called divinity exemption. So there's a question to have that exemption in Israel. And initially he held, not only do you conscript men, you conscript women, even if they were observant and orthodox. He went to Bnei Brak, which at that time was sand dunes. And he goes into the Chazon Ish's home, and they engage in this conversation. And Ben Gurion, although he was not a believing Jew, but he knew Tanakh, he knew the Bible well. And he held, because he knew the Bible, committed to memory better than most people, he held he was a great Torah sage. That's what Ben Gurion, you read it. He believed he was a Torah sage. So he believed he could go toe-to-toe with the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish was the leading Torah sage in his time. But he felt, he's also a Torah sage because he knows the Bible. After he back and forth, so the Ben Gurion says, but how do you know? How do you know you're right? So Chazon Ish points to his heart. He says, of course, my heart tells me I'm right. There's right and wrong. If a person has no conflicts of interest, the way God created the human being, knowing everything, which he did know everything, and he lived it and internalized it, and he sacrificed for it, his heart is that pure heart. When he says, my heart tells me this is the right thing, that's the source of everything. That's the source of truth. Because you can know everything, but if you're not in any way subordinated and subjugated to God's will, you say your heart may tell you that, but who's your heart? Your heart is you. You, who are you? Why are you more than anyone else? But if your heart is pure, because it's subordinated and subjugated and negated to the will of God, God has the ability to process truth. He says, that's where it comes from. It's my heart. No, there's an expression. People have an axe to grind. You present a certain proposal, and right away people are opposed to it. They haven't even heard it out yet. The person didn't explain what his position is. People are already opposed. What are you opposed to? Once you first hear what it is, then we'll talk about whether you embrace it or you reject it. Why? Because people have preconceived ideas of what that is, but it's not being responsible. Now, I think I'm a pretty smart person. I understand where you're going. I reject it. But how do you reject it? You haven't heard what it's about. I don't have to hear what it's about. I have a sense what it's about. It's not for me. How would I call it? It's called one or two words. Either it's called arrogance or it's called stupidity. If it's not an important subject matter, so you say it's called arrogance. If it's something of great importance, and you should hear it out first, it's called stupidity. That's what it is. But what is it all about? Why do you want to dismiss it so quickly? Because if it doesn't meet my standard, well, what's your standard? Your standard is called ego. That's what your standard is. If that's the case, it's a problem. Because if it's ego-driven rather than truth-driven or fact-driven, you're going in the wrong direction. Because who said that your ego dictates correction, the proper path? So I'm just explaining that as complicated as the human species is, when he infused them with that soul of life, and he functions as an intelligent being, rational being, but simultaneously, we have phenomenal conflicts. And we have the ability to delude ourselves and deny ourselves and to go in a state of what? Of almost like the Rambam writes, we live in a trance-like state. We just drift through life and there are many goalposts. We don't see the goalposts. You go right over them. You have many barriers. It says detour. You should detour, go to the side, go straight, head on. But why don't you see it? The answer is because people could delude themselves to such a degree that what should be seen is not seen. No, there's an expression, he's a person you can't talk to. You can't have a rational discussion with that person. You can't have a rational debate with the person. Because the person is so one-sided, as much as you try to convince him differently, he's not convinced. I'll give you an example. Korach was a cousin to Moshe Rabbeinu. The fathers were brothers. And Korach attempted to usurp Moshe's authority, and actually he led a mutiny, and he convinced many people to be part of that mutiny against Moshe Rabbeinu. That's what he did, and he was a very smart man. Conniving, strategizing. He was wealthy, one of a kind of wealth, and he nearly succeeded. Moshe Rabbeinu felt that the moment was so serious because he knew if he doesn't repent, he and his community would be destroyed. As the Torah tells us, the earth opened its mouth, swallowed him up, and it was the end of their lives. So he goes, although he's being the one who's being victimized, Moshe Rabbeinu was willing to swallow his pride, not that he had, because he was the most humble man who ever lived. And he goes to Korach to talk to him. And Korach remains stone silent. Doesn't respond. Now, why didn't he respond? If you think you're really right, you should respond. So Korach said, if I respond, he's going to answer my response. And ultimately, he's going to convince him that I'm wrong. I don't want to be convinced I'm wrong. Therefore, it falls on deaf ears. He did not respond to Moshe Rabbeinu's advances or suggestions. Say yes or no. If you find a fault in it, reject it. So why? Because he says, because once I enter into that discussion and into that dialogue, I'm losing the battle. And I've lost. But what's your objective? If the objective is to do what you're supposed to be doing, and now you're not, so if that's the case, just cancel the program at this moment. But he wants that because he wants the independence. That's egocentric. The ego's driving him. That's the reason why. Even as a prophet, he himself, when he's communicated by God, the deciphering of the prophecy, who deciphers it for him? Hashem deciphers it. It's an immediate computer printout, whatever that vision was. Could you trust the person's own interpretation? We're all human. We have certain biases. They may be subtle, but when you need accuracy and precision and absolute truth, the slightest degree of bias automatically throws it off. So therefore, the Rambam says when a prophet prophesies, it's not only does he see the vision, but even the interpretation, the message which comes through that, that's God's interpretation So there's a question. If that's the case, what do we need a vision for? Right? Let the person just meet God in this trance-like state, and he'll communicate to him what does it have to start with? A vision? Then he interprets the vision. Right? Why? The answer is because, the Ramchal asked this question, because if it would be direct communication without coming first in a allegory type situation, the Navi, through the prophet, through this experience, he understands many things in existence are only symbolisms. They represent things, because he saw the sheep and the brook and the tree in the setting, and it was deciphered by God in a certain way. When he should see this again in other settings, he's able to conjugate the various components and understands this is what it's about because of the experience he had through the vision. But if God would not interpret it, and he would have his own interpretation, as perfect as he is, nobody's perfect. So the moment you possess that imperfection, you may be off a little bit. It's not exactly what God said. But what is this all about? But why don't you hear it exactly as God said? The answer is because there's always that ego plays for us as long as we're alive, the ego. That's what it is. And that's the challenge. And this goes back from the very beginning. Even though you were in the Garden of Eden, you came out of the Garden of Eden, it doesn't make a difference. So how do we somehow open our eyes to see things in a truthful context? How? You have your pupils dilated. Sometimes, if there's too much light, you can't see. You have to actually wear sunglasses because the pupil's wide open. So the eye has to be open enough to be able to utilize the light that's there to see what you should be seeing. If it's too much light, it's magnified to a point, it becomes almost like distorted. And if there's not enough light, then you don't see it. So it has to be precision light, a balance, sufficient but not too much, to be able to see all the nuances of what you're seeing. Otherwise, you see the object, but you don't see the nuances and the creases and the form and all that you should see. So what is the mechanism which God gave us? It's called the Torah. The Torah is a spiritualization of the person. The Torah, the study and actualizing it, it touches us in a way where we become spiritualized. The moment you become spiritualized, you have a sensitivity for what it is and what it's not. And therefore you have that ability to make the evaluation. Although it's a spiritual evaluation, it's a new endowment. When you study the Torah, you have an endowment. The endowment is, although you're a physical being, you have that ability to make these evaluations. Of course, they put you in such a situation where a person's naturally conflicted and they have no way to combat that, what's the chance of succeeding? You can't succeed, impossible. But if it gives you the mechanism to create that clarity and to elucidate these facts, then we're ahead of the game. And what is that? That's the study of the Torah and the observance of the mitzvahs. We'll stop here today.